We'll start off episode 7 with the night after that big storm, and Mr. Dudley heard some rain, but nothing of what Hugh is describing. As they're discussing the cleanup and the storm, Stephen notices that one of the walls seems to be squishy. And unfortunately for Hugh, there's water damage throughout 3 layers of the house going down in the basement. Hugh, looking to see the extent of the damage, hammers a hole in the wall and takes a Polaroid, and he confirms that it's black mold, but he also gets this really creepy image of a person. But the big issue is they don't know where the water damage is coming from. So Olivia agrees to look over the blueprints and draw some possibilities to where it could be coming from, and they'll try to figure this thing out. The big issue, though, is that they can't get into the red room. So it could be coming from the red room, although it could be also coming from rats because they keep hearing scratching. But when they have a guy come in to look and examine the damage and clean it up, he says it could be rats, but it would be a lot of rats. But this needs to get cleaned up, and it's probably going to cost a lot of money, so Hugh ends up bargaining with the guy to rent the equipment, and him and Steven will just work on it themselves. So as the crane men put hazmat suits on and start working on it, Olivia comes down and hands them the blueprints, but it's weird because she doesn't really look like she's been doing anything other than drawing the shape of their dream home over and over and over again on these blueprints. And it's really puzzling to Hugh. And when Mr. Dudley sees this, he says, it's probably not my place, but it might be best for her to get away from this house. To which he responds with, well, you're right, it isn't your place. And that's when Mr. Dudley starts telling the story of his history with the Hill House. About how his parents worked there, and he was actually born on the property. They bought the house that they currently live at from the Hills, and his mother would continue to work there and sometimes have to work nights. And when she would work nights, she would come home and be kind of scattered, to the point where she would actually just wander off into the woods and sometimes sleep there. But eventually, Mr. Dudley started working on the property, and then up hiring Mrs. Dudley to look after Mrs. Hill, and the Dudleys ended up falling in love, and Mrs. Dudley ended up getting pregnant. And Mrs. Dudley worked up until the day she gave birth, but she never complained because she's a tough woman. But unfortunately, when she gave birth to her stillborn daughter. And since we all cope in our own way, she only took a month off before she was back working in the Hill House. But because Hazel Hill was so sick, she was having to work nights, and one night in particular, she could hear the crying of a newborn baby. And Mrs. Dudley searched all over but couldn't find this child. And Mr. Dudley is convinced that that crying was the sound of his daughter. And because she was working nights, she also started to act scattered with just weird behavior, to the point where Mr. and Mrs. Dudley refused to work there after night. They said, as soon as we serve dinner, we're out of here. And you can fire us if you want, but we're not spending a night in this house. So Mr. Dudley says, while it's not my place, once again, it might be best if your wife starts acting scattered, that maybe she spends some time away from this house. So Hugh is processing this because she has been acting a little weird, but he's still trying to figure out where the water damage is coming from. And after an accident with an industrial fan that cuts up his hand pretty good, he gets pissed off and motivated and tries to muscle his way into the red room, but it doesn't work. So if you're keeping score, his hand's all jacked up, there's black mold in his house is haunted, and his wife's going crazy. And when I say crazy, I'm talking he wakes up in the middle of the night and Olivia is on top of him with a screwdriver to his neck. Now, she finally snaps out of it, but she keeps reiterating that she's having the weirdest dreams. And that's when Hugh can't ignore it anymore and brings her in to her work area and shows her the blueprints. It says, you were just drawing our dream house over and over again, but Olivia doesn't remember doing that at all. In fact, she's claiming that she didn't do it, but she did. Hugh brings up maybe it's best if you spend some time with your sister and get out of this house, and Olivia agrees. So the next day, Hugh continues to work on the water damage, and he's spraying this chemical on the wall, but he once again starts to hear the scratching, and he's convinced it is rats. So he chisels out a couple of bricks, but when he looks inside, it's a skeleton, and he calls the police, and they take it out, and the police officer alerts him that he might have solved a 44-year-old cold case, because William Hill has been missing since 1948, and it appears he walled himself into the house, but then he regretted it later and tried to start scratching his way out. So right before the one cop leaves, he asks, hey, is it true about this house? And Hugh says, what do you mean? He says, is it haunted? Hugh said, yeah, I mean, my kids think they're seeing stuff, but I guess. Now, we see that cop again because he's the cop who interrogates Hugh Crane. And at first, it seems like he's trying to wiggle a confession out of him, but after a while, he's just trying to wiggle information out of him. Cop says, look, man, I'm getting frustrated because when I bring up it's a suicide, you get pissed off, but I obviously can't bring up the other scenario in the situation, so you gotta tell me what happened here. Like, for example, why did it take you 3 hours from when you discovered her body to call us? Hugh says, I was in shock. I was mourning. And the cop is simply trying to piece this all together because Hugh is claiming that Olivia went out of town, but clearly she didn't, but Hugh thought she did. And when Shirley saw their mom in the kitchen, she was freaked out, went upstairs, and woke up their dad. So the cop says, what happened after that? Because Shirley says you went to the red room. What did you see in there? And Hugh says, well, that room's been closed since we moved in, but in reality, When Hugh went up to the red room, it was open. But we fast forward to present day, which is funeral day for Nell Crane, and Hugh meets Shirley at her house, but Shirley's stressed out because the florist screwed her over. And Olivia's behind Hugh reminding him that she needs her space, so he decides to go visit Theodora, who is very hungover and very remorseful. She tells her dad that she fucked up even for Crane standards, and that she'll be shocked if Shirley ever talks to her again. Eventually, though, the two head up to the service, and Hugh is kind of looking for somebody to talk to, and he settles on Luke. And at first, Hugh tells him how proud he is of him for getting 90 days clean, but Olivia reminds him that he doesn't need to say anything, he can just sit there and be with him. So Hugh does that, eventually Theodora walks over, and as all three of them are talking, the girl from the one-night stand walks in. And at first, Theodora gets really pissed off because she feels like it's an invasion of her privacy. She didn't invite this girl just found out about this from the obituaries. But then she warms up to the idea and invites her in. And this spurns on a conversation between Hugh and Luke about how Hugh and Olivia actually knew that Theodora was a lesbian from the age of like 8. And in fact, it was Olivia who guessed it. But the conversation is put on hold because Aunt Janet has shown up. And Aunt Janet was obviously the woman that they grew up with. And they're very fond of Aunt Janet. But Aunt Janet isn't very fond of Hugh because she feels like he killed her sister. But at this point, it's time for the eulogies. And Luke actually shines in this, telling a great story about how even though he was 90 seconds older, it was always Nell who was the older sibling. It was so good that Hugh says, who knew Luke had it in him? But the group disperses to the cemetery, and Shirley's having an issue because she doesn't have a ride. Actually, she has a ride, but she refuses to take him because the one limo has her husband in it, who she's pissed off at, and the other limo has Theodora in it. So she settles on a ride with Hugh. And Hugh was trying to talk to her about what happened with Theodora and how forgiveness is there, and in the grand scheme of things, it can't be that bad, even though Hugh doesn't know exactly what Theodora did. And the whole time, Olivia is in the backseat telling him to stop it. And he should have heeded her advice because eventually Shirley just says, you know what, stay the fuck out of my business. So everybody reaches the cemetery and they're all throwing dirt on the casket, and Luke gets down and throws dirt and looks up and he sees the ghost of Nell Crane, and she just says, don't. And then all of a sudden his arm is grabbed by the ghost of his mother, who is grabbing at him, pulling him in the grave, yelling, stay, please stay. Stephen comes to his aid and grabs him, and he's beside himself saying, did you see that? Did you see that? And Stephen goes, no, I didn't see it because nothing's there. Do you want to end up like Nell and mom and dad? Get it together. They're dead. It's nothing. And Hugh overhears this, but when he comes over, Luke acts like everything's fine. So when the group gets back for cocktail hour, I guess it would be, Hugh goes over to Luke and is explaining to him that he overheard what happened and that he sees Olivia every single day. But Luke is playing it off like it was an embarrassing thing and he didn't see anything. And eventually he just wants the conversation to end, so he says, I'm going to go outside and grab a cigarette. But this day is coming to an end, and Hugh sees Stephen about to leave, and he asks him if he wants to go get a drink, but he says, no, I have a flight early in the morning. And he says one more thing. And Olivia is whispering into his ear exactly what he should say, apologizing for not fixing things, not being there. But all Hugh can muster is, have a safe flight. And right behind Hugh, Shirley is looking through her purse and she can't find her credit card. At the same time, Theodora runs in and accusing Shirley of having her car towed because she can't find her car. And after wondering what happened, eventually they ask, has anyone seen Luke? And Hugh says, yeah, I saw him about an hour ago and he was over here. He said he was going to take a cigarette break, but obviously this isn't a great look for a recovering addict. So as Shirley runs outside to try to track down her brother, Theodora notices that there's like kind of footprints on the carpet. And as her and Hugh track the footprints, they go into the office and notice that the model of the dream home is broken. And when Theodora gets down on her knees to look at it and examine the damage, all of a sudden she's attacked by the ghost of Olivia Crane. And she really freaks out. Shirley runs in, sees what happened to her model, and is asking, how did this happen? Who did this? But Theodora can't even talk, and Hugh Crane is just saying, it was like that when we got here. I can fix it. I can fix it. Thank you for watching this recap. If you do not see the next one up in the corner right there on the end screen, don't worry, it'll be up shortly. Please consider following the channel. That'd be cool. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. And if you don't, there's a thumbs down button for a reason.